Have you ever thought about the rules of your job that aren't actually written in your contract? Well, here in Switzerland, there's this powerful legal rulebook that's always working behind the scenes. And today, we're going to pull back the curtain on that very document, the Swiss Code of Obligations. I mean, really think about it. Is that piece of paper you signed the entire story? Or is there something bigger, an invisible framework that's setting the real boundaries and filling in all the gaps? Well, that's exactly what we're diving into. So here's our game plan. First, we'll get to know the rulebook itself. Then, we're going to unpack the 3 different types of rules it contains. This part is super important. After that, we'll see how it answers all your big job questions, figure out who it actually applies to, and wrap up with the single most important takeaway. All right, so what exactly is this rulebook? We're talking about the Swiss Code of Obligations, or as pretty much everyone calls it, the CO. Now, it's a pretty massive law, but we're going to zoom in on the one part that matters most for your job. This is it. Title 10, Articles 319 to 362. These few dozen articles are basically the foundation of Swiss labor law for anyone in the private sector. You can think of them as a default guide, a safety net, and a set of terms that you and your employer just can't negotiate away. Now, here's where it gets really clever. Not all rules are created equal. The Code of Obligations uses 3 completely different kinds of rules, which lets it create a balance between being flexible and being protective. Let's get into how that actually works. Okay, so you've got 3 main types. First, there are imperative rules. These are totally set in stone. Then you've got semi-imperative rules, which are all about protecting the employee. And finally, you have dispositive rules. These are the flexible ones that you can actually change. Let's look at each one. All right, first up, imperative rules. The key thing to get here is that they are absolute. They cannot be changed. Not by a contract, not by a verbal agreement, nothing. They're locked in to protect both you and your employer. Here's a perfect example. The law says that, yes, an employee is obligated to work overtime if the company needs it and it's reasonable. This means your contract can't just have a clause that says overtime is never required. It's an imperative rule because it protects the basic ability of the business to function. Next up, we have semi-imperative rules. Now, these are really interesting. They're designed specifically to protect the worker because the law recognizes that in most cases, the employee is in a weaker bargaining position. Think of it as a protective floor that you can't go below. I want you to look at this number, 4 weeks. This is probably the most famous semi-imperative rule in all of Swiss labor law. You guessed it, it's about vacation. The law guarantees an absolute minimum of 4 weeks of paid leave. Now, your company can for sure give you 5 or 6 weeks because that's better for you. But what they can never do is offer you just 2 or 3. That's that protective floor in action. And finally, we have the dispositive rules. These are basically the default settings in your employment contract. The law provides a standard answer, but it gives you and your employer total freedom to agree on something different if you both want to. Let's go back to our overtime example. Remember how the obligation to work overtime was imperative? Well, how you get paid for it is dispositive. The default rule says you get a 25% premium or equal time off, but your contract can absolutely say something else, like that a certain amount of overtime is just included in your salary. That flexibility is the classic sign of a dispositive rule. Okay, so we've got these 3 kinds of rules. How does this all actually play out in real life? Well, the Code of Obligations uses this system to give you a clear roadmap for your entire time at a company, from your first day to your last. It breaks everything down into 3 logical phases: how your contract starts, what's expected from everyone during the job, and how it all comes to an end. And for each of these stages, the CO has answers to the big questions. At the start, it defines what makes a contract valid in the first place. In the middle, it lays out your duties, like loyalty, and your employer's duties, like paying you and giving you vacation. And at the end, it sets clear rules for things like notice periods. Now, this next part is really, really important. The Code of Obligations does not apply to every single job in Switzerland. You've got to know which world you're in. And it's actually pretty simple. If you work for a private company, the CO is your guide. But if you're a public sector employee, working for the federal government or your canton, you're probably covered by a totally different set of public laws. Knowing which sector you're in is absolutely key. Okay, let's wrap this all up. After all this, why is it so important for you to understand how this legal framework operates? Because it's your silent partner. Seriously, even if your contract is just a single page, or maybe you don't even have a written one, the Code of Obligations is always there in the background. It fills in all the missing details and gives you that powerful safety net, setting fair and predictable boundaries for your entire working life. So, the next time you look at your employment contract, just ask yourself, does this really tell the whole story? Or are there powerful protective rules working behind the scenes that truly define my rights and responsibilities? Thanks for tuning in.